when I see people, taking up our services,
Yes.
and they're making like there's value that they get out of it,
Yes.
then I know that my goal has been accomplished. I want them to come and say like that's cool, and I want to put, I want to open an account, and I want that account to be open in 15 seconds. Like they say, I guess, if you want to be a good general, you got to be on the front line,
Yes.
Like if you're sitting in the tower somewhere, and then, I don't know, asking others to send your instructions, I don't think that's very effective. I think maybe like if the organization is very like multi-layered and you have, really good leadership apparatus, then that's okay. But I think as we grow, like for me, it's very important to speak with people.
My name is Kenneth Waiganjo, and today we have the pleasure of hosting Pavel Spirin, our global CEO. Karibu.
Sante.
Yeah, so who's Pavel?
Well, yeah, it's the type of question depends how far you want to go. So I'll start. Probably won't go too far. So
Yeah.
I'll just talk a little bit about what I do here at Scope Markets, and kind of like maybe a bit of background, what led up to it. So I've been in the role now around for a year and a half.
Yes.
And joined the kind of like the original Scope Markets group in sort of late 2021.
Yes.
So being here for coming to now 3 years. September we'll be celebrating my anniversary, and so yeah, I guess kind of like that's the
What day in September?
well, it's August actually, 25th of August.
I did join on the 16th of September, so when you mentioned September,
Okay. Yeah, and I keep saying September, but yeah, it's
actually August.
it's August. But yeah, so being in the role for coming to 3 years, really exciting. Yeah, so kind of like obviously my role has evolved. The group has evolved.
Yes.
We'll talk. I guess kind of like I'll mention that a bit later, but yeah. So being here over that period of time, and really in my role, kind of like very proud to lead the kind of like the group, the retail side of our business. Yeah, I guess that's kind of like where I am, and then kind of like what I do here.
Okay.
Um,
So how did you get into this space of finance?
well, I mean, finance was always a passion. Although I think I kind of like by listening to some like other people, I guess that I have the conversations with or I listen to, I got into the finance game late by these standards. But I always had a passion. I always wanted to be in finance, and since kind of like early days, I pictured myself being in investment banking. So
Yes.
somewhere like sort of top floor,
Yes.
big glass building.
Yes.
That was the dream. But I actually went to
$3,000 suits, yeah.
3,000, whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
Wolf of Wall Street.
Yes.
Maybe not as aggressive.
Yes.
But I actually ended up going into marketing.
Yeah.
But sort of like and stayed there for a period of time. So digital performance marketing, it was kind of just starting out.
Yes.
When kind of Google launched their ad program, Facebook at that point kind of like we're launching. So I started there, and I kind of like got back into, let's say, follow my initial sort of like dream, if you like, what I wanted to do. I got back into it in 2013. So kind of like the passion was always there, and I, from early ages, from kind of like teen, I always kind of like, I guess, looked up to my dad. My dad is a business owner,
Yes.
and and I always kind of like was interested. Maybe because of that, I was interested in financials, or at least at that point, I connected sort of financials with having your own business.
Yes.
So I always kind of like followed it in the background. I always followed markets in the background, despite the fact not actually working, in it. And when the opportunity came up in 2013,
Yes.
I kind of like to actually join and leverage some of the skills, I had, like a lot of skills that I've learned by that time.
Mm.
Then I basically jumped at the opportunity, and since then essentially been in this world.
Tell us a bit more about your childhood and the influences you had that played a role in what you're now doing.
Yeah. Well, I come from a very tiny country called Estonia. which is a small country in sort of northern eastern Europe, only 1.3 million people. And I personally grew up in a small town of only 20,000 people.
Okay.
So I kind of like being on my move all my life, because I grew I grew up and kind of did my first year of school in that small town.
Yes.
And then, when my parents moved to the capital, Tallinn, I kind of like moved with them, and, kind of like I continued essentially growing up there. And then at the age of 17, I started kind of like working with, or for a for a UK based company.
Okay.
And so I kind of like started transitioning.
Yes.
I was still studying, but I was also, at that stage I was also working. And at the age of 19, I moved to the UK.
Okay.
With kind of like with the intention to then move after 3 years to go to the US,
Yes.
which hasn't happened. So the backgrounds have changed. So I kind of like moved around,
Yes.
and kind of like, I guess all my life I always felt that, I never lived in one place.
Yes.
And kind of like I was always sort of, I guess, I was always motivated by something new, by
Yes.
meeting new people, meeting new cultures, going and kind of like trying something different. I was never happy with, here's your kind of like mold,
Yes.
wherever you are, whether it's a city, a circle of friends, or circle of business contacts. I always wanted to kind of move somewhere else and do something bigger.
Yes.
I didn't know like sort of like, and I guess, well, you never really know where you're gonna end up, but I
Yes.
always had this kind of like big dream to make a difference.
Yes.
So that's kind of like what motivated me to, to continue pushing and continue doing something and really challenging myself, all the time. So yeah, early influences, I guess, comes from my family.
Yeah.
So I really kind of like, so my dad always kind of like taught me that, you need to succeed on your own.
Yes.
And at times it was a bit tough, maybe he was overdoing it a bit.
Yeah.
But that was kind of like the starting point. And then from there, kind of like most of my initial circle of, kind of like immediate circle of friends, they were always older people.
Yeah.
And I kind of like, I had the benefit of kind of like being like from early ages, like with people that are always older. And so like I always felt I had catching up to do.
Yes.
When you're growing up, it's a bit hard, because you're like two heads, shorter than them.
Yeah.
but that's that essentially. And then I always kind of like found myself in the outside of my comfort zone. When I first moved to the UK, it was a new kind of like culture, new country for me.
Yes.
And I always found myself sort of like in the middle of it. Like I was always doing it head on. It was very uncomfortable at times.
Yeah.
But I just kind of like persevered. And yeah, you kind of like the saying is, like what doesn't kill you make you stronger,
Yeah.
but
Indeed,
it's not true. but so it was tough. But yeah, I guess kind of like these sort of like influences, that I was always seeking and putting myself in the situations that kind of like I wasn't maybe used to, or I wasn't ready for,
Yeah.
but it's kind of like I always thought, I'll just go in and I'll figure it out,
Okay.
So yeah, so that's kind of like that. And I guess kind of like now, we never stop learning really.
Yes.
We always kind of like we find new people,
Yeah.
or new kind of like maybe, I don't know, a book, or maybe there's a fictional figure,
Yes.
that you follow. So I always kind of like look at, to kind of like to kind of like, I guess, follow people, or follow kind of like, or read books, or even watch like things online, that I find inspirational, and kind of like that sort of like, I guess, it gets me going, in that sense. So that influence, like of who I have maybe within my immediate circle, or
Yes.
people that I don't have but I look up to,
Yes.
that doesn't stop, kind of like changing.
I remember reading somewhere that mentors could be writers of books.
Yeah,
Once you
absolutely.
read a book, then you learn from them. Any siblings?
Yeah, I have sort of. I mean, my parents are unfortunately divorced, so I have one brother, coming from the kind of like from the two parents, and then, both of my parents have other families. So I have one basically half brother on my mom's side, and then four other siblings on my dad's side.
Okay.
So yeah, so if you put everybody together, it's
Yes.
by kind of like the standards where I'm from, where the birth rate is sort of like barely matching, the death rate,
Yeah.
or the mortality rate is it's considered
It's
a big family.
Okay.
Yeah,
Blended, big blended family.
that's right.
Okay. Any advice you'd like to give your younger self?
My younger self, I think, there's always an advice to give, and many mistakes that you, I guess, do. I think the biggest thing is like, I like less so now, but in the past, I guess kind of like it's challenging, when you sort of, catapult yourself into situations where you're not comfortable.
Yes.
And I tended to stay in those sort of like uncomfortable situations for too long, So as in, I always felt that there is a reason why I cannot, go forward,
Yes.
because I'm new, so I need to learn a bit,
Yes.
And now looking back, I feel like a lot of that really was just in my head, and especially like when I look at some of the younger people now,
Yes.
and in a way, like, the admiration sometimes when you look at some of the younger people and they just, they just don't care, so they just go and keep doing. And I remember myself being in similar situations, and, I would kind of like hold back, because I didn't feel comfortable. So my biggest advice would be like, whatever I had back then at the time, and I thought that I wasn't ready, I should have just, not ignore that, kind of like that voice. I like to be prepared. That's, I guess, a self-preservation instinct, you like
is.
to,
It is,
so, but I think I allowed it, and I always had an excuse, like, well, I'm in a foreign culture, so, so I kind of like, I better watch out, However, like, I mean, looking back at this, like sometimes I overdid it, and I think, if I was to have another run, I'd probably purchase Bitcoin. That would be the first thing I did. But the other thing would be to tell myself, look, just keep going. Don't let things sort of grind you down.
Okay. You've come to town when we are having demonstrations around government spending, the finance bill, which has been dropped. What's your sentiment? This is not your first visit to Nairobi, so do you feel any difference between the first time you did visit and now? And
it's kind of obviously. I guess I'm not fully qualified to answer, because I'm
just observation.
I don't know. It's hard. I mean, obviously, there is anger, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
so, and I guess kind of like it comes from there has been, a shift in, the political circle, I guess, here.
Yeah.
Then also, like, we are going through, the global economy is going
Yes.
through a period of a downturn.
Yes.
We had the kind of the COVID,
Yes.
black swan, then we
Yes.
had the relief. So I feel the country has kind of like, this sort of global trend, is exacerbating the situation here.
Yes.
But my observation is, I don't know, like somehow, and this is maybe just me being a bit naive and kind of like, because obviously I don't go to, let's say, to every part of Nairobi, right?
Yes.
Not yet, at least. But I just feel it's kind of like it's, there is not like hope is the wrong word, but there's like drive to change things, and
Yes.
it's somehow positive,
Yeah.
So that's kind of like what I feel. I feel like people want change, not because like it's a proverbial, we always want change for the
Yes.
better. But I feel like people are starting to realize what their identity and role is, and they kind of like channeling that into what's going on, Like, I mean, I've obviously been talking with some of the colleagues, and my colleagues are kind of like expressed not the same view, but sort of like the demonstrations in a way, like they are, like if you look at the foreign media,
Yes.
then there's one picture, but if you look kind of like from here, they're they're very channeled,
Yes.
at the one at some at specific ones,
Yes.
they're not like sort of random, chaos going
Yes.
on. And
Yes.
so in that sense, I feel, I don't know, like it just gives me some feel of like, like, I mean, last week, obviously, like we knew like the demonstration started, last week. And, I mean, naturally you have to look at the situation and,
Yes.
you look at media,
Yeah.
but I haven't had any issue. Like, I haven't like a single time, like a thought crossed my mind,
Yes.
to, for example, postpone my travel,
Yes.
somehow I just kind of like had the feeling that, it's it's targeted at something very specific, and
Yes.
it's kind of like an expression of the desire to kind of like for a
change.
change. Yeah. So I don't know. So for me, it's kind of like it's hard, and I don't want to sound insensitive, but
Yes.
that's kind of like my perception is kind of like I see this is like people expressing the want for change.
Okay. We are used to getting your emails very early in the morning. And so question is, how do you balance work and life?
Yeah, I'm glad my wife is not here.
Yeah.
for this question.
Yes.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, I will be lying. Like it's tough, right?
Yeah.
So the role is demanding,
Yes.
not because of the title,
Yes.
but because of the responsibility,
Yes.
for a lot of people, and
Yes.
also for the, you have responsibility too for the company, for the
Yes.
corporate development.
Yes.
Like every company, I like to look at it at the end of the day is just a big corporate citizen. So
Yes.
you want to behave responsibly, and
Yes.
there's many things that go with it. So because of that, the demand of my time is pretty high.
Yeah.
So, and I have to balance very carefully, So, yeah, I'm experimenting basically. I did the late nights.
Yes.
Now I'm doing early mornings.
Yeah.
So, but I try to have cutoffs time.
Yes.
So previously I would always be in something, like I would go to the gym, but I'll be on my phone.
Yes.
I would go and I would like have a conversation with outside of work, for example, and
Yeah.
I'd be looking at my phone.
Yes.
I'd have dinner and I'd be looking at my laptop.
Yes.
So I try to now kind of like to almost say to myself, there is work time and then there is other time. Like for example, now I go to the gym and
Yes.
I just airplane mode.
Yes.
And I don't answer emails, not because like I don't feel like I have to, but it's actually in the long run it gives you a better kind of like a mental state.
Yes.
So when you don't do that, and so like when it comes to family, I'm doing the same thing. Like Saturday, for example, for me is usually off limits.
Yes.
I spend time with my family.
Yes.
Sunday depends, but generally, yeah. So we try to carve out time, that is family only.
Yes.
It's interesting actually. I was reading a post from Netflix's founder.
Yes.
And he was saying that, on Tuesday, no matter what happens, whether, the top floor is on fire
Yes.
or, like things like the company's going bankrupt, he finishes at 5 p.m. on a Tuesday,
Yes.
and that's his date night with his wife, And I kind of like, I read that, and he said like, it doesn't matter what happens,
Yes.
that everybody knows, and that's
Yes.
what he does. So I find like, if Netflix's founder,
Yes.
who's probably a lot more busy than I am,
Yeah.
has time for that, then kind of like, I think it's, we're creators of our own reality, you can be as busy as you want, but in the end of the day, like, like there's things in your life that is not just the work or the, that. So yeah, so I balance. We dedicate time. Saturdays being kind of like days of the week, evenings sometimes. Sometimes we travel together,
Yeah.
so we kind of like try to combine sort of like the official, let's say, business duties and family time. So, yeah.
Okay. So, having been the CEO of Scope Markets for a year and a half, what makes Scope Markets tick?
I think like the biggest thing for me, and kind of like the way I see it, and also like not just speaking for myself, but also looking at the kind of many talented people we have all over the world.
Yes.
I think it's just kind of like this desire to provide value.
Yes.
I know sometimes like, especially it's in this sector, sometimes it's not immediately apparent, but I feel like there is this desire to provide value.
Yes.
And then there's also this desire, it's a very dynamic industry.
Yeah.
So it's this desire to always be, innovate, try something new, change, react to things.
Yes.
So I think kind of like, whenever there's a project or there's a challenge, or there's on the other hand, we're seeing really good growth, like I feel like, we don't sit back and kind of like, status quo, kind of happy.
Yeah.
There's always movement, there's
Yes.
always something. So that's what I feel sort of like, it's what kind of like, it's sort of the heart of the, of our organization, it's
Yes.
always kind of like, it's living and it's always like sort of beating, and that's kind of like what I see.
Okay. Let's get into the nuts and bolts. What can our traders expect, in coming days?
Well, we're going through a rebrand exercise.
Yes.
Obviously, there has been a lot of change because Scope Markets, as a company or as a group, has been acquired by Rostra Group. So there has been a lot of change even on the back of that. Yeah. But I'd say kind of like from what I represent, so Scope Markets, the retail side of things, primarily. I'd say we're going through a rebrand, and the reason for that is because like we're starting to evolve, from our kind of like early days of being sort of a provider of leveraged derivatives to a more sort of like a multi-asset proposition. When we cover different aspects of financial services.
Okay.
So we're investing heavily in the in fully paid equities. Yes. We're starting to look at things like recently we released fractional stocks.
Yes.
Which is a product I personally, I'm very passionate about, and
Yes.
I think that's something that we will be definitely rolling out more, and
Yes.
our customers will be hearing a lot more about that in the coming days.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, but I think kind of like, in the most shortest term,
Yes.
like we focused this year primarily on just making our systems more robust.
Yes.
We've launched, LD4 hosting,
Yes.
to basically to ensure that, the trading environment is better. Our
Yes.
core proposition is there. We have reshuffled a number of liquidity providers, liquidity venues.
Yes.
So kind of like focus on the boring core, so to
Yes.
say,
Yes.
but nevertheless important.
Yeah.
And I think now kind of like since like the skeleton is there and we have acknowledgement from our customer base, now the focus is on kind of like making us a little bit, develop outwardly, so making our, processes, our kind of like softer points of our product, more seamless. And yeah, like you kind of like looking at launching a larger array of products, kind of like products that, are suitable for, let's say, the larger clientele out there.
Okay. A bit more on training and customer service. Can you also speak to that, because that's what the customer experiences.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say kind of like right now, we are not necessarily the best in class, in terms of education, so
Yes.
customer education. I mean, however, kind of like having said that, our model right now is less about sort of like self-education, more
Yes.
about, hosting classes. We're
Yes.
hosting classes here in Nairobi. We
Yes.
have online webinars.
Yes.
We have, a very good kind of like customer sort of support and account management teams.
Yes.
So obviously there's a lot of kind of like, let's say, education happening there,
Yes.
like be it directly to an end customer or be it to a partner or, somebody we'll work with, we'll work with a lot of the external academies and education providers. So I'd say kind of like our strategy is less about trying to be the education venue of choice,
Yes.
but rather kind of like when customers come to us, they can be sure that we will channel and we'll provide them, with the relevant materials. That's kind of like where we are. So I'd say we have obviously our chief market analyst, Josh,
Yes.
who
Yes.
is very often in the media.
Yes.
So we're looking to kind of like right now for me, like the focus is, having stabilized or having kind of like made our systems more robust. Now we're kind of like focusing on the softer, points of our product. Like once that's kind of like in place, then we can start looking at, okay, like, like what is our, what are the providers we're working with? Can we integrate more into our trading applications? That's kind of like what I'd like to see, and that's what we're going to be focusing on going forward.
Okay.
So I would say kind of like this is where we are right now. It's more kind of like one-on-one or sort of like more webinar seminar sort of like education. I guess kind of like depending on the country, depending on where like a specific sort of company within the group. And in the future, kind of like we'll be adding more kind of like self-service, let's say, tools into our trading application.
Okay. Let's talk a bit about culture. Where do you think we are, and areas that we can definitely improve?
Company culture, right?
Yes. Company culture. Yes.
Where we are, I think we're evolving.
Yes.
It's always tricky because we have obviously regulated entities. We have sales offices
Yes.
in different parts of the world. So truly forming a global culture is always tricky, because you have people of different backgrounds. You have people of different different kind of like, I guess, outlooks.
Yes.
On life. So it's always tricky. But I think, we are kind of like, we are all things considered, we are starting to come together.
Yes.
It's difficult as well. Obviously, we've gone through a merger and acquisition exercise,
Yes.
which is also, a very disruptive by nature,
Yes.
a very disruptive experience.
Yes.
So if I kind of like take two of these points and we keep them in mind and us kind of like moving forward, I feel that we are, we have managed to come together.
Yes.
I'd like to think, and I think that we are fully transparent about, we talk to each other.
Yes.
There aren't sort of closed doors. Some companies and some kind of a corporate environments tend to be very official. I feel
Yes.
sort of like we're, one of our strengths is having that kind of like open door.
Yes.
Our group CEO, Michael, he goes around, right, and he kind
Yes.
of like has, he sits down, he has his coffee mornings, he
Yes.
has his
Yes.
chats, that he hosts. So kind of like I feel like we're making a conscious effort, like to kind of like to have a really all-embracing open culture.
Okay.
I'm not like an office sort of closed door kind of like type guy. I just don't like that. I mean, I like to sit on the floor with people. I
Yes.
mean, you will see me in the office though, but that's only because sometimes I like I need to focus, and
Yes.
that's kind of like the only reason. But I like to be with people, and I think we are trying to the kind of the culture starts, I guess, at the top, you know, and I
Yes.
think everybody is making a very conscious effort to sort of like to portray themselves as being one of you know of many.
Yes.
You know, there aren't like sort of like layers, you know, outside of the kind of like formal job titles.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of like where we are today. You know, we're kind of like on that journey. I don't think that we've fully solved it. You
Yes.
know, I think there is work to be done, and I think we need to kind of like to kind of like to really invest more in our inclusivity.
Yes.
So we do of course that, but I feel kind of like, and sometimes it's hard because you have to also balance, you
Yes.
know, kind of like business priorities, corporate priorities. So I feel kind of like we need to do more of what we've started.
Yes.
And I think kind of like, yeah, it's being open, really. It's being kind of like, it's encouraging our people to speak up when there's, you know, things, not to hold back.
Yes.
It's also kind of like, it's the attitude, you know, for me, like it's really important to have the, you know, the mindset, not
Yes.
because somebody said that, you know, we're going here, you
Yes.
know, and then everybody's like, yes, we're going there. But it's like, I like to really, you know, work with people and
Yes.
kind of like really make sure that they understand why we're doing things. And
Yes.
if they don't, they can challenge it openly, because if somebody believes in the cause, you know, then it's a lot easier to work together in general. So I feel sort of like this is for me personally, this is has always been a big thing,
Yeah.
you know, kind of like sort of demonstrate the vision, but not as a fancy words on the screen, you know, and make people follow you just because, you know, they feel that, you know, they have to because of the structure. But really just kind of like making sure that people understand, you know, why we do this. And I always try to kind of like relay, you know, and say, well, you know, I mean, you're welcome to come and sit in this seat, you know, and kind of like, or I can sit in. It's like, so for me, it's like I want people to really understand, like, you know, ignore the roles, like at the very sort of basic level, you know.
Yeah.
Do you see why we're doing this?
Yes.
And you know, I'd like to think that, you know, we're doing things for a reason, and so, you know, I'd like to think that people see that, you know, and yeah, that's kind of like where you know my focus is, you know, when it comes to culture, is really kind of like, you know, getting everybody rallied because they want to do that, you know. There's the point doing something that, you know, if people don't want to do it, you know, then so for me, yeah, so for me it's kind of like that. So I think like there's work to be done more in
Yes.
that,
Yeah.
really kind of like communicating it down to, and having more of these maybe, you know, simpler, you know, closer conversations. Sometimes like, you know, when you do a town hall and it's like 200 or 300 people,
Yeah.
and at the end you sort of like, any questions, right?
Yes,
And then
and they are
people,
none.
yeah, you know, and then whereas for me I think it's if we do like a more focused discussions and, you know, kind of genuine, normal, kind of like nothing like sort of forced, then I think you can get people to, you know, if people could basically open up, right?
Yeah.
If you can peel away some of these layers, you know,
Yes.
then I feel it's easier to explain because the guards are down, so you explain, and then yeah, and after that it's kind of like it's then easy to kind of like to rally people around, you know, that kind of like common vision. So I feel sort of like we're doing that when time allows. I think we should be doing more of that. I think there's work to be done, but ultimately I look back at if I look at us today, I think we're in a good place overall.
Okay. In my previous industry, we always talked about future proofing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit about that? You know, where you see our industry going, what it will look like in 5, 10 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we never know, right? Because it's very dynamic, and
Yes.
you know, things like COVID, you know, really like
Yeah.
could put the industry on its head
Yes.
and change things.
Yes.
I mean, for me, I think more and more people want to be financially independent, and you know, people always wanted to be financially independent.
Yes.
It's the system that we live in,
Yes.
right? So it unlocks a lot of the potential, you know, that people have. So I think the kind of like that notion is becoming more widespread. You know, it's no longer, you know, Wall Street or some big banks,
Yes.
you know, in Frankfurt or in London. You know, it's becoming more and more accessible.
Yes.
And the leveraged industry has been kind of like the first one to emerge out
Yes.
of that accessibility.
Yes.
And I think they've done a fairly good job at sort of opening up and providing their services, you know, to the mass audiences.
Yes.
I feel, however, that, you know, like we are starting to live in a more complex world. And I also feel that the leverage industry alone, you know, like is not able to kind of give that sort of, because we have to remember that, you know, like leverage and kind of like the leverage services, you know, they carry a certain degree of risk.
Yes.
And if we look at our parents, if we look at our grandparents, you know, like where, if they are invested at all, you know, where sort of by, you know, by history, would people be invested? I mean, I grew up in sort of in the, in Estonia during kind of like the Soviet times, let's say, right? So like, so back then it was all about, kind of like cash or something to do with the government,
Yes.
Post Soviet sort of restructure, it's the government. You invest in government bonds, you invest in debt, and a lot of the capital is still invested there. Now the stock market is something new, to a lot of us. In the U.S., it has been functioning for much longer.
Yeah.
So what I feel sort of, and then I look at some of the sort of pioneers in like Robinhood, for example, in the U.S.
Yes.
So I feel these trends are starting to kind of like cascade, and they're accelerating,
Yes.
because we're living in a very globalized digital world, Obviously AI is the new thing, but so like our speed of progress is a lot faster. Like last 20 years is probably more than 100 years prior, and last 100 to 20 years is more than 500 years prior, right? So that development is accelerating. So I think to future-proof the industry, we need to diversify, and we need to kind of like be able to cater to a much wider audience. And so for me, that comes stepping away from purely leveraged products.
Yes.
And starting to roll out things that I mentioned, cash, fractional stocks,
Yes.
or fully paid equities, or government debt sort of securities, exchange traded funds, mutual funds. So a lot of that, and some of it is even more simple. Some people just want to get interest on their cash. So having a product that caters for that. Banks today, charge a lot of money for or they will give you a very small interest.
Yes.
So it's kind of like, but there's no reason for that, So for me, it's kind of like to future-proof what we do, what the industry does. I think we need to start moving away, and some people have started, and we have started moving away, just relying on one kind of like side of financial services.
Yes.
They're always there, and the more educated people are, generally, the more people understand risk, the more they want to go back to that.
Yes.
So I feel kind of like it's not that the industry is swapping for something else, it's more that it's expanding.
Okay.
So I personally see it sort of like financial inclusion, having a mobile app where people can decide, like M-Pesa, like you can do a lot of things with it. So it's kind of like the similar, like you have a mobile app.
Yes.
You may have your interest bearing account,
Yes.
where you hold your cash. You may have, for example, you may want to, have a currency conversion app, where you convert your shilling into dollars,
Yes.
because you travel or because you just want to hold something in dollars. You have equities on one side that you can purchase and hold, domestic equities, foreign equities. You have other instruments, and then you have kind of like the trading corner, where you kind of like you experiment and you do a bit more. So that's ultimately what I see kind of like happening in the most immediate sort of like future.
Okay. On leadership, what's your philosophy? You've done this for many years, not just at Scope Markets, but previous places.
Mm-hmm.
But what's your philosophy? How do you lead from the front? How do you inspire others to follow?
Yeah. Well, so it's kind of like goes back a little bit to what I said about the culture.
Yes.
So I like to I like to have a hands-on leadership approach,
Yes.
which, some people disagree with, but for me, it's like I like to lead by example.
Yes.
So that does mean, putting in a little bit more, but I think like if, like people have to see, like, it's sort of like they say, I guess, if you want to be a good general, you got to be on the front line,
Yes.
like if you're sitting in the tower somewhere, and then, I don't know, asking others to send your instructions, I don't think that's very effective. I think maybe like if the organization is very like multi-layered and you have, really good leadership apparatus, then that's okay. But I think as we grow, like for me, it's very important to speak with people one-on-one. Like I don't differentiate between, for example, speaking with, a group CEO and I don't know, a person who just joined,
Yes.
their internship program, for example. Like for me, it's the same.
Yes.
I don't change language, and I don't try to be a different person. Like I try to be the same person. So for me, it's kind of like it's really just showing that, like we've all been there, kind of
Yes.
thing. I've been there. I've done. Kind of like, I've been at this first stage, of my career,
Yes.
in marketing.
Yes.
I've been doing kind of like assignments and tasks for other people. Then you kind of like, so, you learn and you kind of like, a lot of things like, like when you go through that phase,
Yes.
you kind of like, you start to recognize good and bad leadership very quickly.
Yeah.
And I felt kind of like, for me, it's always like, if a manager at the end of the day doesn't relate, or a leader doesn't relate to you, and it's very difficult to follow, the vision, instructions, and so on. So for me, it's very important having that dialogue, having that sort of understanding, because I want people to be bought into what we do, and if people don't fully understand it, I would rather take my time and explain at the expense of, getting things done on time. I would kind of do that. So of course it's a balance, but yeah, ultimately I would say kind of like field leadership by example. Setting the vision, sharing my experience, kind of coaching is kind of like, I like these types of, I don't like sort of, do this, do that, sort of very monotonous, sometimes it is needed, but I try to kind of like also even then, I try to kind of like say, look, we have to do it this way and we don't have the time for arguing because of X, Y, and Z, So, but yeah, it's kind of like it's based on mutual respect. I think like that's it's not based on well I have this title, so do I send an email? You have to. It's based on respect. I'd like to think that people like they do things like my team, like immediate team, does things not because I ask them to, but because we're on the same page. And people want to help, and I want to help them. Ultimately, so. Yeah, that's kind of like my leadership style. That's ultimately what I think works best, And I've had the experience in different settings in different companies, and also different. I worked in different countries as well, lived in different countries. So for me, it's like I've seen how different cultures operate. I come from a very top-down culture. Of leadership, where sort of like I guess kind of like being sort of like a Russian background. So I have the the kind of like the top-down approach, and I've seen how it. I've seen people, kind of like being in that environment. Conversely, when you go to kind of like the UK, and I worked in, with the Scandinavian kind of cultures, Swedish cultures, Norwegian cultures, it's very different, It's very flat structures. Everybody is sort of like is a friend. So sometimes it also doesn't work, because you just can't get things done. So to me, it's kind of like it's finding a balance. But ultimately, I think that respect, if it doesn't come out of fear, if it comes out of, respect and genuine, kind of like desire, to kind of like to listen and be together and do the thing, that you will get a lot more done, because you then don't need to micromanage. You don't need to police people. Like I don't believe in micromanagement. I don't believe in policing. I believe in having the right team and the right people, setting boundaries, and then work within those boundaries and checking in every now and again on what we agreed to do. Because like that means I can focus my time on things that I know that I have things covered, so I don't need to check in every day, like how is it, how is it going there. And we have tools and systems in place for elements that for example, like if there's more scrutiny required, there are tools and elements that would allow us to do. So so kind of like in a nutshell, I guess kind of like that sort of leadership by example is sort of like is what I think it's natural for me, but I also feel it's an effective model. Certainly worked for me in the past, and I continue sort of professing it here at Scope Markets, and I think it works well. You guys you be the judge, but I think that's my impression at least.
Let's go back a bit to the Scope Markets rebrand. Tell us a bit more about that and how it all fits within the Rostro vision or the Rostro plan.
So I guess kind of like there's the corporate reason for the rebrand is that merger and acquisition that happened. So we're trying to kind of like to sort of like say to the that we are a new company. We're a new brand. We're a new scope. We are historically Scope Markets was sort of like a bit of everything. Institutional business, retail business, professional business. We are kind of like splitting now into different. So we'll have two different customer-facing brands. We will have Scope Markets reserved for kind of like more retail, sort of like B2C consumers. And then we will branch out into a separate brand called Scope Prime. That will be for more kind of like institutional. Of course, it's all interlinked. So it's not that, like it's two completely separate units, but, we have a different leadership team for both. And, that will be more kind of like sort of seen, more visible. So that's one kind of like reasoning for the rebrand, the acquisition, the kind of like the new identity, being part of the larger group. Rostro comes with a lot of advantages. In the new brand, you will hear us talking about inclusion more. So that's one of the kind of like key points within our vision. It's catering to kind of like down from a very tiny, small sort of, couple of I guess shillings investors to multi-million-dollar kind of like hedge funds. So it's kind of like it's that inclusion, and it's providing. Previously, everything was done out of Scope Markets, and now it will be done out of separate brands. So it's kind of like stratification of of the proposition. So that's kind of like one reason. The other one is what you said about future proofing.
Yes.
So we are very cognizant of that.
Yes.
I myself, kind of like I've been trading, since 2018. Well, let's say technically 2018, in
Yes.
earnest from 2020.
Yes.
So kind of like I get the firsthand of, kind of like a firsthand experience of, kind of like markets and so on. And also like I see what others are doing. So the second reason is that we are mindful, and we not doing it because others are doing it or because, but also because we ultimately, the society is changing. The demonstrations you mentioned, I think, while not close, like related to anything we're discussing today, but I think it's just kind of like, the generation Z or Z, I mean, that's kind of like your, people's interest, and, a lot of it is shifting over time. So I think the rebrand is also kind of like an opportunity for us to say that, we're not just kind of like the old sort of, leverage derivatives sort of based broker, but we are a much more all-inclusive, kind of like, firm that offers a lot of different services. So the fractional stocks product that we briefly mentioned, I mentioned, is something that is going to be coming to the forefront of what we kind of like want people to do.
Yes.
And ultimately, we want to attract a lot more people.
Yes.
We want to, when you speak with people individually, whether in business context or outside, everybody is interested, but nobody is taking the plunge.
Yes.
So, and why is, I feel, is because they come to your website and they look at it and they're like, okay, well, that's cool, and then that's it, right? I want them to come and say, like, that's cool, and I want to put, I want to open an account, and I want that account to be open in 15 seconds.
Yes.
I want everything to be electronic, automated.
Yes.
And I want this to be a very like sort of a breeze experience, or you download you download an app from Play Store or Apple Store. So kind of like that's where the rebrand is laying that foundation. You will see it's a lot more, I guess, kind of like more modern, in the way it looks and feels.
Yes.
And will be supported by some very fundamental technological changes we'll be doing in the background. Come to customer onboarding, the payments experience, the trading environment itself. So I mean, I spoke about the core, but we will be changing the actual kind of like front end layer as well. So so that's kind of like, that's the driving vision. It's a long-term vision, like we're not here for the next, kind of 3 months and let's kind of like do something else. Like it's a long-term, laying the foundation and kind of like, really looking ahead for the next 5 years.
Okay. Next question. Lessons you've learned as a CEO of Scope Markets. You visited a lot of markets. We are expanding globally. What are the lessons you're taking from these experiences, and how do you apply them to make you a better leader and also for you to perhaps be more impactful?
Yeah. So I think the biggest experience, this industry in that sense, and I've seen this in other companies as well, where I had the privilege of working. This industry is truly global.
Yes.
Sometimes we kind of like, of course, from a local perspective, like if you have a very specific role in a specific country, like it can be seen sort of like here. However, like I look at it and it's truly global, because even if your role is to say kind of like, you have a very specific functional role for a specific market, most likely that in order for you to do your role, you have to rely on services that probably don't originate from inside the country, be it a relationship with the liquidity provider, be it the system that you employ. Most likely you're employing it from somewhere else. So the kind of like the lessons I've learned kind of like going around and, traveling, I've been traveling quite a lot this year. Every market is different. And I know it's like a very cliche kind of like thing to say, think global, do local, or, those things, ultimately, like, what are you doing, if you're like, so this is kind of, we know these things, and, you don't necessarily need to travel to know that, but I feel kind of like people have different needs, and to me, you need to look at the core, like, because what are we here for, as a company? For me, and going back to kind of like, what I like want to do, like to my, like you asked in the beginning, sort of what I stand for. I want to make a difference, right? And to me, it's like it's adding value, and so like ultimately when I look at our company, I want to be, not sell like CFDs or, fractional stocks. I want to be able to add value. And so to me, like when I'm, when I see people, taking up our services, and they're making like there's value that they get out of it,
Yes.
then I know that my goal has been accomplished.
Yeah.
So when I apply this sort of notion to the question,
Yes.
then that value generation is very different by country.
Yeah.
So hence why our products and our approach has to be different. Sometimes the products don't have to be different, but the approach has to be different.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't speak the same language,
Yeah.
right? Here in Nairobi and in Kenya in general, like I mean, this is kind of like luxury. Let's say, everybody speaks English, right?
Yes.
But you go to South America,
Yeah.
where I travel for personal reasons quite a lot,
Yeah.
and you find yourself in a different world, right?
Yes.
You go to some of the Asian markets, and it's
Yes.
very different. So you have kind of like that. You have the localization.
Yes.
Then regulation is very different by the markets. In some markets, we cannot offer our services because regulation doesn't allow us to. In some markets, there is no regulation.
Yeah.
So you're sort of like in this semi sort of uncertain stage.
Yeah.
So I think it's down to what's the biggest lesson. Like you need to really study the local market.
Yes.
Like not just study it from like I'll go on the internet and I'm gonna read up on South Africa, and then I'm here.
Yes.
You need to go. You need to meet people.
Yes.
And you need to kind of like spend the time in the country, I think, and with people, and really understand, before you kind of like do anything else, because you may find that actually you have a product, you have a service, you have localization,
Yes.
but culturally you don't connect at all.
Yeah.
Your message is just going to be really not fit for purpose.
Yes.
In which case, like you probably shouldn't launch in that country. And at the so for me, it's kind of like it's really understanding the reality, whether it's regulatory reality, cultural reality, the some of the local aspects like language reality. And then from there, like once you really get that, you then see, do I have a product and service today that will match that? Am I able to generate value?
Yes.
And then if I cannot, then, and you still like, there's an opportunity from a business point of view, can I then launch something that, that does that?
Okay.
So the biggest, I think, lesson is, we, and not just we, but, some of other, let's say our dear friends, competitors, people there's this sort of, and I felt it as well, like, I happened to work at Alpari, which was back in sort of 2013-15 period,
Yes.
one of the largest brokers, kind of like, well, globally. And, there's always this sort of desire to go to the new market,
Yes.
let's just launch in the new market. Let's just do that. And
Yes.
then you find yourself completely unprepared.
Yes.
We did that in my previous company as well. We went to some of the European markets and, like completely sort of unready. And then the result is, well, the same preparation you put into it.
Yes.
If you put 5%, you're going to get 5%.
Yeah.
So for me, it's kind of like, don't rush, focus on, what you already have, probably, and sometimes, it's, we talk about opportunities, sometimes you may, and I've actually seen this at Alpari, like a lot of the people you may have in-house,
Yes.
they are already the experts, so like you may have somebody in the team that comes from a foreign background.
Yes.
And actually that somebody actually could become your country manager,
Yes.
so there's a lot of opportunity. So I would say look inside first, see
Yes.
what you already have, maybe expertise in-house, maybe some, lessons you've learned. And then with that in mind, kind of like just narrow down that list and, just be realistic with what you can do as a firm.
Yes.
And kind of like don't rush, do it right. And yeah, just commit to it once you've decided to do it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's been a great pleasure having you around, and also
Thank you very much for having me.
speaking to us.